So we've been working through some issues raised in this book, Emotionally Healthy Church or Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, in order to help us address some of the below-the-surface issues in our lives, in our church, in our spirituality. So far we've explored our past, our upbringing, the way that imprints can be positive and negative, and last week Kevin looked at the issue of grief and loss and how we can embrace that as a positive thing as we move forward in our spirituality. Today I'm looking at the rhythms of the Sabbath. Now, this time last year I preached a sermon series. I'm not expecting you to remember it, but if you do recognise this picture, it was about a 24-hour period in the life of Jesus where so much stuff happened in one crazy intensive day. Like there was teaching and healings and crossing the lake and calming the storm, and so much stuff was happening. It actually culminated with receiving the news of the death of John the Baptist. And I mentioned that at the end of this day, Jesus and his disciples, they were done. They were exhausted. They were spent. They had nothing left to give. And Jesus in Mark chapter 6 said this line. He said, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Let's be honest, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Who would like Jesus to say that to us right now? Come with me to a quiet place and get some rest. We're going, yep, sign me up. All for that. Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. The Bible is full of these encouragements to stop and rest. We have some of them up the front here, which we looked at in the kids' talk about being still and know that I am God, or waiting for the Lord, or the one from Isaiah that says, when we wait upon the Lord, God will renew our strength. It sounds great. It really does sound great. But for many of us, it almost is unrealistic. We live in a society where everything is sped up. We're always on the go, go, go. We rush through each day, each week. Can you believe we're nearly halfway through this year already? We cramp so much in our life that we become time poor. And so the idea of slowing down just seems crazy. And Jesus says to us, come with me to a quiet place and get some rest. And we go, yeah, nice idea, but we just don't have time for that. We just don't have time. And so we rush on, cramming more and more things into our life. But as we do that, we begin to wonder if we're missing some of the blessings that come with slowing down and making that room for God. Our first reading comes from the part of the Bible where Moses receives the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20. Actually, in that large section of the Bible, there are 613 laws that God gives the people of God back then. And yet, God, for some reason, decides to highlight 10 in particular as being very special enough to call commandments. And out of that 10, one of them is about stopping and resting. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? One of the 10 commandments is this idea of the Sabbath, to remember the Sabbath. 6 days we're to go, 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 but on the 7th we are to stop and rest and do not do any work, because the Sabbath day is holy. It's interesting, isn't it? God actually commands us, must know us well, commands us to stop every now and again, because it's a good thing for us physically and spiritually. Before I go on, I've got to say there's two big problems with me preaching on the Sabbath and stopping and resting. All right, let's talk about the elephant in the room. I'm not good at this. I'm really not good at this. And I'm not the person who can stand up the front there and say, I practice what I preach on this topic. It is a problem. I'll admit that up front. I also think there's a second problem, that for us, the way that we struggle with the concept of the Sabbath is going to be different. my problem with the Sabbath is probably not the same as your problem with the Sabbath. And so how do I preach in a way which we're all going to learn something from this sermon or be challenged or have God speak to us this morning? And so instead of just preaching one sermon, I'm going to preach 3 small sermons. I'm going to give you 3 very different perspectives. One is a perspective from the book, Emotional Healthy Church or Emotional Healthy Spirituality, and I'll share his perspective. I'll also share a perspective that I stumbled across a number of years ago that was quite helpful for me. And I'll also share an interesting discussion that's happening in mental health circles at the moment and give their perspective. And hopefully one of these might speak to you. Actually, I'm going to ask you at the end which one resonates most with you. So you better listen to all 3, just so that you're able to answer the question. Are you ready for this? Let's jump in. So firstly, with the book, Emotionally Healthy Church, Scazzero has a really interesting chapter on this. And if you wanted to read it, I can lend you the book. But he begins by talking about that there's this pattern of rhythms in the Bible. And one of those rhythms that we see in the Bible is the rhythm of the Sabbath, about how God sets up this rhythm: work, rest, work, rest. And when we learn that rhythm, it's helpful for us. He would actually say spirituality is learning and aligning our rhythm with God's rhythm. And he refers to an example of the daily office, the regular set of prayers of aligning our rhythm with God's rhythm. You may have noticed that I've used the metronome as one of the graphics for this. It's just because I'm talking about rhythm, but also because the interesting part about a metronome, or the particular one I have on the screen, is that for it to work properly, it has to have a moment where it stops. Like it swings from side to side, but when it reaches the end, it actually has to stop for a moment before it goes back the other way. It's part of the way that it works. If it didn't stop, it wouldn't work. It would just go around in circles. I suppose you can get metronomes that go around in circles, can you? I don't know. But in this particular one, it's that rhythm of stopping and swinging backwards and forwards that allows it to do its job. And I would argue that's what the book, Scazzero, is trying to say, that we need to learn what that rhythm is in terms of the Sabbath. So Scazzero would argue that there is a rhythm, a weekly rhythm of work and rest, and that rhythm is spiritually helpful. Or inversely, he would argue, if we get that rhythm wrong, if it gets out of whack, it's not helpful for us. It's spiritually unhelpful, or we can get our spirituality out of whack. Which sort of links with the second reading that we had from Hebrews, that weird one where Paul goes around in circles and speaks like Paul normally does. If you wanted to try and sum it up in a sentence, Paul is saying there's a rhythm that God has put out there. This rhythm of entering into rest, working and entering into rest. And people understood that throughout history, but some people didn't get it right. And they haven't entered into that rest. And they need to learn to get into that rhythm, because that rhythm brings life. Scazzero finishes his chapter by saying the Sabbath should be understood not in terms of saying a Sabbath you should do nothing. Just do nothing. Make sure that everything else is done the day before because you're not allowed to do a thing on the Sabbath. He would argue, no, that's not what the Sabbath is about, but rather the Sabbath is inviting you to participate in different things. Things like to stop from your regular work, not to do your regular work on the Sabbath, but to step away from that, to rest, to focus on the things that give you life. That could be sitting out in the sun or having a nap, but it could also be, working on a hobby, to delight in our relationships with each other and with God. In the Middle East, the Sabbath is really seen as a chance to get together with other people. And lastly, he says that the Sabbath is an invitation to contemplate, to reflect, to think about God and to learn. And that's why we do worship on our Sabbath, so we can connect with God and learn and grow. It's part of what Sabbath is about. So it's not about doing nothing, it's about doing things differently. So we are given this gift once every 7 days of the Sabbath, to stop, to rest, to delight, to contemplate. I guess the challenge for us is, are we making the most of that gift that comes around every single week? Here's perspective number 2. As we've talked about, the Sabbath is a time of stopping and resting. And this perspective particularly looks at when you've had one of those days or weeks or months where everything is just piled up upon you, a bit like what Jesus and the disciples had in that earlier example, and you just have to stop. You just need a break. You need to step away from life and just take some me time. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yes? Yes? Those times when you're at breaking point and you just need to stop. And that's a good thing to do. And I really encourage that sense of self-care. But I want to share this discussion that's happening at the moment in mental health circles about whether self-care is too broad of a term. And they've actually suggested another term called self-soothing. And to understand the difference between the two is important. Has anyone been seeing this discussion going on? Self-soothing and self-care? Or am I giving you new stuff today? Excellent. All right. The difference between the two is, let's say that you're exhausted and you need to stop and you need some me time, and you just might, binge a TV series, or you might make yourself a G&T and sit out on the back deck, or you have some retail therapy, or you scroll through your phone, or you treat yourself to a nice meal, or you, if you're me, play computer games. It's like a distraction from the pressures of life. And it does give us comfort in that moment. It's a good thing to do. But some people in the mental health circles are now calling that self-soothing, because it's great in the moment, but it may not have any long-lasting benefits, which is where it differs from self-care. Self-care is something where afterwards you feel rejuvenated or filled up. It's just not for in the moment, but rather it's for the future as well. So it could be things like doing some exercise or some therapy, or making time for friends or family, or practicing meditation. It can even be as simple as boring and mundane, like refilling your prescriptions. Self-care is being mindful of your needs and fulfilling those needs. So how does this relate to the Sabbath? I would say that the Sabbath should be about self-care, not just about self-soothing. And this is a particularly challenging idea for me, because I'm a person who does go hard on the 6 days, and when it gets to my day off, I do crash. And if I'm honest, I would say that possibly over the last 2 or 3 years, my Sabbaths have been nearly solely self-soothing, about just stopping and distracting myself from life, doing the things that I enjoy in the moment, and very little about self-care. And I'm being challenged whether that's helpful, or whether I need a balance of both self-soothing and self-care activities. How do I embrace the Sabbath as a way of enriching and rejuvenating my soul? The third perspective comes from an interesting play of words that I came across a number of years ago from another passage in that big long narrative of receiving the laws. This one's from Exodus 24, verse 12, when God says to Moses, "Come up to the mountain and stay here." Come up to the mountain and stay here. It's interesting that most translations of the Bible, where it's got that "stay here," translate the Hebrew word as "stay here." But if you go to the Hebrew word is actually haya, which means to be or to exist. It's almost like God saying to Moses, come up to the mountain and be. Just be. And we go, well, what does that even mean? Come up on the mountain and be. Yet, there's a part of me that goes, I think God knew exactly what he was asking Moses for. As humans, we are very good at doing things. We are doing people, aren't we? We do things really well. God knows how we're wired and probably knew that Moses would probably spend most of his time going up the mountain thinking about what's going to happen on the mountain. When he gets to the mountain, think about what he needs to go down and do next. And God's saying, I just want you to be present with me, fully present on the mountain's top. Just come to the mountain and be. Just stop and be fully present for a while. We struggle with that, don't we? It's not the way that we normally live, just to stop. We're always dwelling on what's next. Have a look at these pictures that I found on the internet and just reflect on what it means to be fully present. They are very challenging pictures. As I said, have a look at them. What reaction do they stir in you? Actually, let's make this a participatory question. What reaction does it stir in you? Are they real? Too close to home? You don't think they're true? That's a good thing, Harrison. Yes, that's interesting. The shadow of the phone is on the other person. Yeah. Yeah. How we can be right next to a person and not be there. That was the artist's attempt in doing these. How we can be present but not be present. And I was just challenging this idea of how do we be present with somebody. And maybe that's what the Sabbath can be about for us. One of the challenges of the Sabbath is learning how to be present again. How to be truly present with the people around us. To be with them. Or to be with God. So there you have it, 3 different perspectives. One encouraged us to embrace the rhythms of the Sabbath, to stop, to rest, to delight and contemplate. One explored the idea of self-care and self-soothing and wonder whether we've made our Sabbaths too much about self-soothing, about crashing and being, just resting, rather than the Sabbath being about rejuvenation of our souls. And the third one about, is the Sabbath a time to be with people, to be fully present with others and God? So which one resonated with you? I was going to make you put your hands up, but I think maybe that's a bit too confronting. But seriously, in your head, I want you to answer the question. Which one is resonating for you? Which one is God speaking to you today about and going, you know what, I'm going to try and do better, a little better on that over the next little while when it comes to my Sabbaths. May we all embrace the rhythm of the Sabbath, and in doing so, find the spiritual growth that comes with that. Amen.